Good morning, everybody. It's Billy here, Billy in B-Town, and I'm with my special guest, David Sanchez, aka Grandpa Moose. Say hello, Grandpa Moose.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Good, how are you? And I asked him to chat with us a little bit today about the history of Southside Billings and how he came to be here as well. He's been a Billings native probably since you were born here. You've lived here, born and raised here. So tell us a little bit about your dad and Refugio, how he came here from Mexico, and I'll let you tell a little bit about how that came to be.
Okay, this was when my dad came to Montana. It was during the Revolutionary War that my dad come over. His grandfather brought him over. He was only 7 or 8 years old. And his grandfather was kind of well-to-do, had a warehouse and stuff, and the revolution started. And then the opposition for Mexico raided my great-grandfather's warehouse, and they threatened my grandfather if he didn't give the warehouse up, they were going to kill him and my dad. My dad was just 7 or 8 years old.
Jeez.
And his grandfather gave up his warehouse, crossed into Texas. I think it was Eagle Pass, where all the Mexicans used to run through and come into the United States. And then after it kind of calmed down, his grandfather took him back, and he started his business over again. And little to be said, his grandfather built another warehouse, and he ended up doing the same thing. They threatened to kill him, and him and my dad, he brought his dad back over to the United States. And then I think by that time, the second revolution, my dad was probably 12 or 14 years old, and him and his brother, his grandfather went back and he died, and my Uncle John, my dad's brother, they stayed here and started out in Kansas. The railroad had not come to Montana yet, so him and my Uncle John were worked and came across into Montana. They came from Kansas, where the railroad had continued growing, and then he ended up here in He ended up in Butte.
Not crazy.
And then he went to, and then he ended up coming to They worked a branch and ended up in Billings, and that's where he met my mom, and that's when I was born in 1935. And come to find out, and I didn't know, but I was born in the Mexican colony.
Yeah, and your birth certificate even says, so he pulled out his birth certificate and it even says Mexican colony. And that was located on the south side of Billings, right?
Right by the sugar factory.
By the sugar factory. How cool is that? And then...
and there they had the sugar factory. Some of the Mexican people, when they first started coming to Billings, that's where they were supposed to, that's where they stayed. The sugar factory had some land right there. Right now, at this time, there's the big mounds, piles of dirt, and that's where the Mexican colony was located. And I was probably 3 years old, and I remember running up and down the streets. There's only 1 or 2 blocks, and the only watering hole they had a pump. They had a pump you used by hand, them old-time pumps, and that was the watering hole. Everybody used to take their pails and buckets and fill up the water for their necessary kitchen needs.
And the houses were made of?
And the houses were made out of mud, probably like adobe, because they had straw and put together and dirt floors. And to cool them off in the summertime, I remember my mom and my grandma sprinkling water to keep it cool. And it really worked.
Yeah.
It really worked good.
And didn't you get in trouble for pulling straw?
I'd pull the straw out of the walls. And of course I got in trouble with my mom chasing me trying to get...
Yeah.
But and all the Mexican people, even lots of them have moved, but some relatives of theirs, and they've stayed here, and a lot of them are still here in Billings.
That's so cool.
The older people have died, you know.
And then you've got an article here. Your your dad, I call him Grandpa Refugio, but he was in an article actually with your brother Ruben Sanchez back in the day, and it just talked about basically what you just mentioned, how he ended up here and stuff. So that's pretty cool. And then there was also a picture for a very long time that was in the Beanery. I don't know if you guys remember the Beanery. It was Trailhead Spirits after that, but a picture of him and his co-workers on the railroad.
The railroad.
Which was really cool. So that hung up there for a very long time. And then he pulled up these pictures. It's really cool. It was a baseball team.
That's Mexicans had their own baseball team.
How cool is that?
They couldn't play with the other ones. They were a lot of prejudice during that time.
Yeah.
And that place where they played was right on State Avenue, and I think it's Sugar Avenue. It's the street on the west side of the sugar factory, and that's where the baseball.
Oh, okay.
That's where they played baseball and practice. And my wife's grandfather was the manager, and that's George Alva, and he's been around forever. He worked for the sugar factory.
That's so cool.
And after then they got to where they could play. They got to play other teams, and I think the prejudice had eased up. So they played and were a pretty good baseball team from what I hear.
Yeah.
But I was 8 or 9 years old when I used to watch them. But and then they had an old schoolhouse right there where they played baseball.
Oh wow.
And then after that, I remember after the baseball team, everybody, of course, went on their way and had their families that were too old to play. And by then, I think the Cobb Field had come, and every Mexicans could try out, colored people could try out, and it was a little. The prejudice had let up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a little schoolhouses there, and of course they tore it down. That's where all the Mexicans went to school, right by the sugar factory at that schoolhouse. But during the war, right after that, I think in 1945, when the war ended, they had a concentration camp with a lot of prisoners from Germany, and we used to drive by there off State Avenue. We used to see them, a lot of prisoners, and they ended up here in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, after they had the trials with the German conspirators, then they all got to go home.
And tell us about the story. You said that people were.
My wife, when she was little, Phyllis Oliveros, which is an Alva, as I mentioned before, her grandfather worked for the sugar factory, so he had a lot to do with helping the Mexican people. And my wife used to tell me that there was a lot of apples trees growing around down there on the south side,
mm-hmm.
and her and 4 or 5 other kids would pick all the apples and run up to the fence and toss the apples over to the prisoners, and they just loved that.
Isn't that crazy?
That was.
It's amazing to me that we had concentration camps here in Billings.
Yeah, and I remember going by there a couple of times, and I was, 8, 9 years old at that time, and that was 1946 probably, that was...
Wow, that's amazing.
I was able to see a lot,
mm-hmm.
Being as young as I was, and I got to see some of the things that were going on, so
mm-hmm.
I thought that was pretty. And then also my mom and dad were married in the Little Flower Church.
Oh my gosh!
And there's a little story that I have to tell, that when we used to go to church, they had a balcony And I was real little, 3, 4 years old, and I'd peek over the balcony. Well, come to find out, the Mexicans were restricted to that little area. Nobody could go downstairs. But I used to have fun because I thought, oh wow, I
get the sweet views from the balcony. The balcony views.
But of course, things in the land have changed also.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about, because you grew up after the South Side on Howard. That little house is still there, and you could see Broadwater School from there because there's no other houses.
There weren't very many houses.
Yeah.
The what would you call that? The city limits was right at where 6th Avenue or 6th Street West started, and from there, it was nothing but hay fields.
Wow.
You could not see. There wasn't anything there, and then after the war ended, of course, they made the veteran housing projects, and that's where my house sits.
Oh.
This used to be a veteran housing.
This house right here?
No, the
Howard
property. They tore them down since then.
Oh my gosh.
Because they built these houses, and a lot of these old homes were moved in from the east end of town. So you see a lot of homes that were a lot of house movers at that time.
Oh wow!
And used to move. You'd see them moving houses all over the place.
That's crazy.
And in fact, they moved quite a few houses there on 5th and Howard, where we lived. But you could see Broadwater School from there.
Wow!
And it was very. And at that time, before I started school, I couldn't speak English, so I learned very nice teachers. I remember Mrs. Cartmeal and Mrs. Rose.
That's crazy. You can
and
remember.
I loved school, and awesome. I learned English fast, and we taught my parents how to speak English.
Really?
So
wow, that's awesome. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, does anybody have any questions, real quick, before we end this video? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to see if anybody has any questions. See, a lot of people are watching. Hello, everybody. Thanks for watching. Anything else that you can remember real quick, and maybe it'll give some people a chance to ask a question about. I know that I remember you telling me that you remember, because you were born. You didn't go to a hospital, right? When you were born,
no,
you were born.
That's another one, Billy. I remember my grandmother, the Alvas, the Navas, the Romeros. All these ladies were taught hospital care. And I've got pictures someplace and I couldn't find them, but I'll have to get them and show you.
That'd be cool.
They dressed in white, and once a week they went around to all the houses, and they learned how to. They were taught hospital care.
Wow.
For the sick children and whatever.
That's cool.
And they wore bonnets. They had a bonnet or a hat with a big red cross on it. That Red Cross volunteers is what they were.
Wow.
And all the women did that. So that was something I remember, but I didn't know why they were like that, why they would dress in that garb.
Right.
But as I grew older, my mom and dad used to tell me, well, they learned they were taught hospital care, and probably that's where I was born, maybe one of them.
Wow. That's crazy. Yeah, you probably were. They probably helped you because they're like midwives, right? I mean, basically like doulas or whatever.
And they did have a hospital a little later. Mm-hmm. They call it the county hospital, and that's where all the Mexican people went. Mm. They didn't go to St. Vincent's. They had St. Vincent Hospital was very small at that time. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's still there, the original structure. Oh. And they've added to it. But it was a small hospital.
Really?
But the county hospital was over on the bench where the heights. Oh. Where the river goes by, you can see the river. Yeah. There was a county hospital there, and that's where I remember where some of my brothers and sisters, I think maybe my sister and a brother were born there. And we used to go there, and my wife and dad that's where they ended up at.
That's so cool. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I figured that this would be a great time to talk about the history. Cinco de Mayo's coming up. So remember, it's not all about just drinking Coronas. Yeah. There's definitely some history behind the meaning of Cinco de Mayo. So I want to thank you again for taking the time and just letting everybody know what you had told me the other day. I thought it was such interesting information about the history of Billings and your Mexican culture. So thanks again, Grandpa Moose.
Thank you, Billy.
All right. Well, you guys have a great weekend and a happy Cinco de Mayo, and we'll see you next week. Bye. Bye. We should dance or something. Woo!